Okay, let's jump over to communication planning here. So one of the first aspects when you're doing your planning, obviously, is you need to figure out what you want to do. Okay, so you got to ask yourself, what's your communication objective? Are you trying to raise awareness? You're trying to change a preference. You know, I'm on the commercial side a lot, so we're trying to change a buying preference, for example. Are you in a crisis? Is it crisis communication? So I think that's probably one of the first things you need to ask yourself. So in terms of general planning, you need to look at a project communication strategy, okay? And you need to ask yourself, you've got to define that strategy, and it's done to ensure that you've got stakeholders that are engaged. And the other thing you want to do is you want to muster support for your program. That's the two primary reasons to do that. So just a quick review, the reason you do a communication strategy is you do it to identify the communication strategies for your specific audiences that you're looking at. You want to identify the communication mechanisms and the tools to be used and define the key prospect messages, outbound messages that are going out. And you also want to detail the responsibilities, how the feedback will be provided by the stakeholders and dealt with by the project. So you've got your communication strategy. That idea is also used to define the approach for monitoring and evaluating where you want to go. By contrast to that, you should also have a project communication action plan, okay? So usually include that in the appendix, and we'll ask everybody here, do you actually do some of these things? Usually a standalone document, but it's used to document specific communication activities and programs that you're undertaking. So generally details, for example, alignment of specific stakeholders and stakeholder groups and your key messages that are out there. And the communication tools that you're going to use, so the time frames, the feedback mechanisms, and the associated cost with all this stuff. So regardless of the size and complexity of the project that you're doing, the action plan really should be maintained as a separate document. Okay? So the question I've got for you, and I've fallen into this trap very early in my career where you actually you create an action document or an activity document in terms of program activity or in terms of communication activity, but you actually never create a strategy document. So I think that's generally the way that a lot of people do that. So how many of all of you have actually, and raise your hand, have actually spent the time thinking about creating a strategy document that then supports your activity? So just a couple, right? So what happens, excuse me, a lot of times then is you end up just doing as opposed to understanding why you're doing. Hence the reason for the strategy document. Okay? So once you've defined your stakeholders, and we're going to go over this a little bit in terms of a stakeholder communication plan. Once you've defined and articulated who your stakeholders, then you can, I think, really develop your communication plan. So you do that by identifying who the stakeholders are, what details need to be communicated to each of those groups, how often and the frequency that you need to communicate, where the stakeholders and how the stakeholders are going to be communicated to, okay? So communicating the status of active projects relies on the same type of audience awareness. So if you're looking at your audience, you have to ask yourself, how are they consuming their media, okay? Everybody's different, everybody consumes it differently. And I'll give you the instance here just in terms of news consumption. How do you get your news? Do you read the Sacramento Bee every day? Do you go on the web every day? Do you get it on your iPad every day? You see what I mean? So you need to take all of that into consideration in terms of your communication efforts and how you're reaching out. So develop your plan by asking the right questions. So who the stakeholders are, project sponsors, team members, customers, community members often show up on stakeholder list. And a lot of times you'll have the press as well as key stakeholders. In terms of the details communicated to each group, that depends on their level of involvement. So who needs to know what, right? So when must a project team communicate with each group of stakeholders? Some require daily attention, some weekly attention, some monthly. Okay? And that you need to determine as well. So we talked about when stakeholders are supposed to receive their communication. Is it a single channel or is it multiple channels? And think about that interaction as well. Okay, as opposed to, once again, just doing. And then probably one thing I think that some people don't spend a lot of, or I should say spend enough time thinking about is how project team members communicate with stakeholders. Because you're on the ground, you're communicating with various project and team members. The question is who's doing it and to what degree are they doing it, okay? So I guess one question I have for all of you is, usually you've got a project manager, so does that project manager as a normal rule end up being the de facto communication director for the project? Or do you actually spend time saying, this team is going to handle the communication activities? So for everybody who's the project manager and communication director, so you end up all as one, right? Okay, so when you do that, so let me ask another question of everybody. In terms of your communication expertise, how comfortable do you feel actually putting together a strategy and a plan and then executing on it? Does everybody feel good about that? Or I could use a little bit of help? Okay, so then the next question is do you seek counsel? So, you know, most agencies obviously have an outbound business liaison office. You know, you get communication professionals that are used to doing this all day, right? So do you seek that advice from time to time? Or do you just kind of, once again, go off and do it?